cause of anthropogenic climate change is the increasing rate of emissions of carbon dioxide from energy use. It's not the only cause, but it's a major one. And economists are unanimous, very rarely, that the best way to tackle such an issue is through a carbon tax. That is, putting a tax on the use of hydrocarbons that is related to the concentration of carbon within them, which is then released when they're burned into the atmosphere. And a number of countries have implemented carbon taxes at the national level, but they tend to be quite small. And one of the reasons they tend to be quite small is that countries are worried about the competitiveness effects, particularly on their energy-intensive industries. At the moment, the carbon taxes are much too small to trigger the kind of move to non-carbon energy sources that we need. But there's no earthly reason why at the global level, if you were to implement it at the global level, you wouldn't get these competitiveness effects, because all countries would be levying the same tax on the same industries. And then very large revenues could arise from that. And obviously you would then need to discuss what to do with the revenues. You might decide to use them for some global purposes. We know, for example, there is a commitment to have a global climate fund of $100 billion. At the moment, no one knows where that money is going to come from. Well, it could come from global carbon tax, and global carbon tax at a relatively modest level would easily generate that sum of money. On the other hand, you could just allow member states to keep it. They would levy the carbon tax at the national level, but it would be globally the same rate in all countries, and then they would just keep the revenues, and they would be able to reduce other taxes or do whatever they liked with that money, because it would be national money. And it really is a very kind of uncontentious proposal if the world was serious about reducing carbon emissions. Answer that question. There's no reason why it would have an adverse effect on any country, developed or developing, if all countries were to do it. What it would do is give developing countries a source of revenue, which they don't otherwise find very easy to raise. It would mean there would be less pressure on them to try to tax labour, for example, and the one thing that they find difficult is to tax labour, because they have large informal labour markets which are difficult to capture in the tax system. And in any case, why would you want to tax labour when you've got enormous unemployment or underemployment? And simply making labour more expensive by taxing it is the best way to encourage employers to use less of it. So there could be lots of benefits. Obviously energy would be, or carbon-based energy would be less expensive. That would accelerate the move to renewable energy. Well, many of these countries have significant renewable energy sources. And the technologies now exist where perhaps they were much less well developed 20 years ago for developing countries to implement those technologies, and it would become more economic for them to do so in a context where there was a high carbon tax. So what we know is that both the use of natural resources, especially renewable resources, and the use of materials of all kinds, many of which are associated with considerable energy use, and that of course is problematic from a climate point of view. We know that we need to increase resource efficiency and resource productivity very greatly. Factors of 5, factors of 10 by 2050 are commonly cited in this regard. And I guess the issue to do with green growth is whether people feel that this is feasible to reduce the quantity of resources that we're using and the amount of environmental impact that we're having, while the rich world continues to experience growth in incomes. These two kinds of growth obviously are quite different. Growth in environmental impact, growth in the use of resources is a kind of physical and energetic kind of measure, whereas growth in incomes is a monetary measure. What we know from the historical record is that They have been linked in the past. Economic growth, i.e. income growth, has tended to be related to growth in energy use and growth in material use. On the other hand, it's not a linear relationship and it's not a constant relationship. It changes over time. And I think the nub of the disagreement over whether green growth for developed countries, and I must distinguish there, I don't think anyone is saying that the poorest countries shouldn't experience increase in their incomes, and that's often a straw man that is put up to discredit the kind of no-growth position. So the issue is whether rich countries can continue to increase their incomes while the world as a whole moves towards a situation of reducing its emissions, its environmental impacts and its resource use. My own academic work suggests that that is theoretically possible, and that it is certainly technologically and economically possible. The fact that we've not achieved it yet is because, frankly, we haven't tried. First is that I think developing countries as well as developed countries need to recognize that there is no high growth, high carbon future. That a short to medium term high growth trajectory, which is what they want, that depends on high carbon, will, in the words of Nick Stern, kill itself, because climate change will kick in towards the middle of the century in a way that makes growth in those countries impossible. You've only got to look at what's happening in Pakistan today, in Thailand today, in terms of the flooding that they've recently experienced, to know that the impact on GDP, on growth of these climatic events is potentially catastrophic. So sometimes the debate is conducted in terms of a kind of trade-off, that we can have growth or the environment, but not both. That may have been true in the early days of industrialization. It's not true now. If we don't get